so much, Amelia, and welcome to From Mandated Reporting to Supporting. And it's really great to see, I see some familiar faces, I see some old professors on this call, so it's really great to see you all. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Jasmine Wally. The sun is coming in because it is 3 o'clock in Sacramento, California, where I'm calling from. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at jmac for Families, just making a change for families. And so we are a community organizing nonprofit, led by people who have been impacted by the child welfare system, or as we will call it throughout this webinar, and how many impacted people refer to it as the family policing system, the family regulation system. So we have programs that serve, impacted parents, impacted people who were impacted as children, and political education programs for these communities, know your rights actions, and legislative, actions. So I will pass it off to Kamaria to introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you all here tonight and be in community. My name is Kamaria Excel. I use she, her pronouns. I've worked very closely with jmac for Families for the past 2 years. So it's really awesome here to be able to talk about our work and our mandated supporting lens. I'll kind of go into a little bit of how this whole entire thing got started. It was awesome to hear Amelia say that you all are the folks that really advocated for us to be in this space. And so some of you might already know some of that, but we, a bunch of us in the fall of 2020, myself, Jasmine included, Joyce McMillan of jmac for Families, John Robertson, who's also here in the space tonight, Jenny Crawford, and a bunch of other CSSW professors, students, impacted parents, community activists began to come together and say, what can the social work profession do to truly holistically center families in a way that divest from systems of harm, of surveillance, and we began to really look at the way that social workers are taught about mandated reporting as one of the primary ways that this field, this profession continues the cycle of harm in communities, predominantly of color, underserved communities. And so from there, we began to create a curriculum called Mandated Supporting, where we really focus on the fact that mandated reporting is not evidence-based practice, it's not intuitive, it's not holistic, it is not harm reductive. And from there, created this 3-module curriculum, which is currently being taught at Columbia School of Social Work, that really teaches social workers a skill set, right? Because I feel many of us can relate to walking away from learning about mandated reporting, not really knowing what the scope of our role is, being deeply confused, being afraid or scared. And so we really wanted to target not only those emotions, but the way that that shows up for the families and communities that we are saying that we serve, but we're deeply harming. And so kind of bringing in perspective, right? Like how we even got to this moment right here. So I'll turn it back over to Jasmine. Let me know if I forgot anything, but.
So just to get kind of started on some framing, just as a base, to get us started in this conversation. So we really see the child welfare system or the family policing system as a arm of this larger carceral system. I think in social work, many of us understand the harms and the racial disproportionalities in the mass incarceration criminal legal system, but we sometimes don't acknowledge the same scope and the same disproportionalities exist in the family policing system too, right? We know that Black, Indigenous and Latine families are overrepresented in both criminal legal systems and family policing systems, right? And to take it a step further, even the term mass incarceration, I think we really ought to be referring to the family policing system in a similar type of way with the similar language. 582 out of 100,000 US adults are incarcerated, right? 582 out of 100,000. 576 out of 100,000 US children are in foster care, right? So the magnitude of this system is, just as far reaching as mass incarceration. Dorothy Roberts refers to mandated reporting as the stop and frisk of caregivers. And a lot of the work that impacted families have been doing, the organizing that researchers have been supporting, all point to this conclusion that implicit biases, explicit biases, all contribute to this disproportionate rate of reports, investigations, separations, and termination of parental rights in low-income Black, Indigenous, and Latine communities. So, even just to take this a step further and, to quote Joyce McMillan, the founder of JMAC for Families, she always draws the connections between child welfare or family policing and mass incarceration. So think about the ways that people who are in prisons are treated versus the ways that children in foster care are treated. Children and adults are removed from everything that they know and love, and everyone, right? They're put into all these different placements. Every time they move placements, they're moving their belongings in trash bags or pillowcases. Changing beds and cells and homes regularly, eating what they are served when they are served. I've been to group homes where the food is locked up, right? Even the language that we're using to describe children and adults who are in these systems, mirror each other. You have supervised visits. Supervised visits can be taken away for any minor infraction. Families are put on probation. There's a probation period during the reunification process. And at any point, a minor infraction can lead to this disruption in the reunification process, right? So all of these terms and these ways we understand mass incarceration mirror the ways that children and families are experiencing the foster care system. So Kumari, if you wanted to lead us into the history piece.
Yes, give me a second, y'all. The technology is always what gets me. Okay, here we go. So we always, of course, like to center the parents and the folks that we work with. So here are a few photos to kind of, bring those folks into the space, some of which are here. I think I saw Shalanda's name. Really quickly, Jasmine has set us up with a really wonderful framing. And so I'll just kind of take us through a session overview of what's coming and then get into a little bit more of the history. So Jasmine set us up with framing. We'll then talk about the role of the individual and collective social work profession, right? It can feel very isolating as a social worker to navigate these, which is a part of, how the system continues to exacerbate itself. And so we'll talk about how you as an individual and the collective field fit into this conversation in ways that we can be doing so much better. We'll then talk about this wonderful framing that Jasmine has so beautifully crafted called the carceral box. And we'll get into what is implicated by that box, what is internal in that box, what's on the outside. And then we'll talk about some forward movement and how to actually operationalize the work of mandated supporting in your private practice, in your community health organization, and wherever you are existing as right now a mandated reporter. So when we talk about the synergies, between interlocking systems of surveillance and oppression that mandated reporting sits under, we really want to think about the fact that this is in the context of the aftermath, of enslavement. There's nothing part of the U.S. fabric that we cannot attribute to the legacy that slavery has left with us. And so we want to think about the ways that Black bodies have always been surveilled, the way that Indigenous folks have always been surveilled, and the way that the system we know today is a remnant of that. We can think about also our social fabrics being tied into that, the way that capitalism, it's integral to that, the way that white supremacy is integral to that, and also who is affected and impacted by that today. So when we think about the impacts on families, of course, it's a rap sheet long of things that we can talk about, the bullet points on the screen do not even begin to talk about and get at all of the impacts, but these are just some things that we want to center for today. And so when it comes to the family's relationship to either the individual social worker or people who are perceived to be the ones who are supposed to be giving care, it sows a really deep distrust in systems, and it impacts it either limits or, for a lot of folks, eliminates the family's ability to feel safe and get support. When I think about this, I think about in a previous organization that I worked with, where I had a Black mama who was deeply afraid to go to the doctor during her pregnancy because for her first child, she held her baby for 10 minutes before ACS took her baby away. She was a high impact pregnancy during that second pregnancy. We could see a lot of ways that she really did need medical care, but that trust was so deeply broken that she couldn't even bring it upon herself to go to the doctor for very real and valid reasons. And so as people who are supposed to be the ones that bridge people to care, that give wraparound services, if someone can't go to the doctor because they're so afraid that their baby's going to get taken away, what does that say about the work that we're doing? Going off of that, the way that it deepens the cycle of trauma across generations, right? I've met with so many families and worked with so many people where they were in foster care, their children were in foster care, right? There are so many ways that their surveillance has been equated to when they have children, that their children are also in tandem with the system. And that's because our work is not effective. Our work is not supporting people. We talk a lot about the ways that mandated reporting is not intuitive. If someone comes to you and says they're hungry, why make a call to a system of surveillance so that they can get taken away from their family? And guess what? The hunger's still there, right? And so this is what it's happening across generations and across legacies of families. So thirdly, turns people away from seeking something like therapy and getting the care that they deserve, right? It stigmatizes using support systems because the support systems are not helpful, right? We oftentimes say that social workers are cops and cardigans, right? And that's just not because it sounds like a nifty, right, framing. It's because it's true, right? We come in, we think that we're the people who are supposed to be supported. We have on our superhero capes, right? Thinking that we're saviors, and we're deeply damaging and tearing families apart. And so while we're always centering impacted folks, impacted communities, it's also important to think about the way that mandated reporting is deeply harmful to the social worker as an individual, which sometimes we don't really think about. It limits our profession's ability to support, to give care. I know that so many social workers talk about feeling trapped, feeling like they don't have the resources, that they don't have the answers or the support to be able to give care to families. It deepens your individual commitment to practices that are contradictory to our ethics, right? If we are saying that we are a part of the people who do no harm, that give care holistically, and yet we are committed to these systems, right? There's a deep inequity within that. We know that mandated reporting is supposed to be reasonable cause, right? But if your reasonable cause is steeped in transphobia, homophobia, anti-Blackness, Indigenous erasure, right? Then your reasonable cause is flawed. And so we need to inspect and tear what your perceptions of reasonable cause is. Fourthly, it deepens, right? We already talked about the trauma across generations, and then is also a part of social workers not even being able to form connections among another. I know so many times when you have maybe a really hard case where you know a family needs a deep level of support, it feels like you're supposed to be the one that knows the answers to that question, that you can't reach out to other resources, that you can't reach out to other social workers. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, our methods and strategies of divesting from that I think it's a veil of secrecy or a veil of privacy that social workers are oftentimes operating from.
Something I'll add too is, so Kamari and I, we both went to Columbia School of Social Work, and many of the students there, and many social work students in general, may not have ever experienced a CPS investigation in their own lives, may not have ever, really seen CPS involvement to a great degree in their communities, and may think that, a call can lead to help for a family. But, Diane Redleaf, she had this great quote that she said something like, when a CPS worker comes to the home, they don't bring a bag of groceries, they come with a psych evaluation, right? So people aren't, the CPS worker isn't coming to the home, asking for help. They're coming to the home to investigate this family. And, perceptions and implicit biases in the investigation process, really affect the outcome of this investigation too. So, understanding that, our first call as the mandated reporter can lead, has all these ripple effects, can lead to this investigator coming in and seeing, oh, the bed is unmade, there's laundry on the couch, right? that has a very different implication in a small apartment building or a small apartment versus a large home, right? If the bed is unmade and there's laundry on the couch, that looks differently in a small home than in a large home, right? The perception of messiness in the home is different. And when you add in race, when you add in gender, right, all these things contribute and are you know, are noted in an investigator's mind and notes, right? And so, you know, this, you know, all this contributes to, you know, can contribute to family separation. And we know the traumas of family separation. You know, the impacts of family separation on children have been well documented. You know, children who experiences 5 or more foster care placements are 90% of them experience incarceration too. You know, the foster care to prison pipeline, right? That's been well documented. Only 50% or so of foster youth graduate high school. Only 3% of former foster youth graduate college. So there's all these implications for child well-being that can come of a report and the ripple effects of an investigation. But I think, you know, what also is really missing from this narrative is that there's a huge impact on the parents themselves. Parents who experience, mothers who experience child loss by the foster care system are experience 5 times more risk of avoidable mortality than mothers who lose their children to death. You know, mothers who lose their children to foster care are more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to overdose, right? All of the trauma of family separation impacts parents too, you know, and I've worked with parents who, you know, who have called the police on CPS because to file a kidnapping report, right? I think there's this narrative that parents don't care what happens to their, you know, if they get an ACS call, or, you know, they don't care, they're not even, you know, conscious enough to make it, you know, to make an effort, right? That's the narrative that a lot of people have. But, you know, I've seen police reports of parents who have called, you know, the police on CPS. You know, so these stats have been pulled by one of my colleagues, Talia Gruber, you know, that really demonstrate the impacts of even this policy of mandated reporting, right? 50% of DV survivors are less likely to seek services if they know that a report is made. And 51% say that mandatory reports made their situation much worse. You know, I've worked with parents who experienced you know, a DV situation at midnight or so, had an ACS or had CPS come to their door at 3 a.m. and then had court at 9 a.m. that morning, right? After experiencing such a traumatic event. You know, I've worked with parents who've said, you know, I'd rather take the beating than lose my kids, right? Or have that option available, right? DV means domestic violence, sorry about that. So, you know, this policy, this blanket policy that, you know, mandates us to report really impacts the ways that people feel comfortable seeking services with us. Yeah, so next slide.
Also add to that too, Jasmine, the way that parents have definitely told us that, like, well, this feels like an abusive relationship, just dealing with the ACS or CPS, the ups and downs, the abuse mirrors the abuse that they've experienced in the past. So going off of that, thinking about our roles, right? Thinking about the ways that we are complicit in the system, when we think about how we should, or the energy we should have going into how we support families. I'm also a doula by training, and some language that has stuck with me has always been holding space, which is something that if there's birth workers in the room, you already know that's like very common vocabulary. And I really see our role as social workers is to hold space, which for me means that we're kind of shapeshifters. We should be flowing and moving in the ways that the families and the communities that we serve are asking us to. So whatever that means to them, whatever role or capacity they need us to show up in, that's what our form should look like. And this comes from deep active listening, right? Not listening to respond or listening to report, honestly, in the context of this conversation, right? When Jasmine was speaking about how, right, caseworkers are showing up into spaces to say like, oh, we've talked about before, like the graveyard, right? Which is like when people have like alcohol on top of their fridge. I was someone in college who definitely, kept a liquor, different types of alcohol on the top of my fridge. That is perceived differently than someone who has a wine cellar who lives on the Upper East Side, right? Both are alcohol, but right, is it brown, is it dark alcohol, what brands are they, right? That's perceived much differently. And so when you're listening, are you really looking around? What types of things are you writing down? What do your case notes look like? We talk a lot about, and have had parents tell us, right, a report was made for one thing and they come in, right, and then now there's 50 other things that now a family has to have concerns about, and 50 other reasons why that family is put into deeper harm. And so when you think of yourself as a shapeshifter and not a savior, right, how were you taught about the communities that you're now interfacing with? Were you taught that they lack resources? Were you taught that they don't have anything, that the communities are desolate and no one exists there? Or were you taught from a strength-based approach where you're human-centered, right? You understand the social and historical context in which the people that you serve live, right? That's going to make a difference of how you're even coming into being a support metric. If you can't see or acknowledge the humanity of the people that you work with, right, we're just putting more people into the system. And so I would definitely say with holding space, acknowledging one's humanity, and also the way that parents have often shared, right, the language that you're even using around families of unfit, right? Everything you say, everything you do matters, right? And so making sure that you have divested yourself from a savior approach.
And just to uplift the comment that I just saw in the chat from Julia, that you need to consider the impact of a report on the whole family system. I really want to uplift that point because, I mentioned all the impacts of family separation, but the report itself and the investigation itself, even if it's not substantiated, is traumatizing on the family unit, right? Children who may be strip searched, looking to their parent to protect them against, taking off their clothes in front of a stranger, right? What does that do? What does that communicate to that child? What does that communicate to that parent? How does that make that parent feel, right? How does this investigation that is so invasive, think about, I think most people can relate to a landlord or a utilities person coming into their home, typically announced, right? But, you want to clean up, you're uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have someone in your home. And to have that someone come into your home, looking through your fridge, looking through your cabinets, unannounced for 60 days, looking for signs that you are a bad parent, that really impacts the children and the parents within this, and, the family system overall. And, so moving on, the carceral box. So mandated reporting, I think really puts social workers into a box and teaches us how to think in a carceral box, and reinforces this through the classes that we get, through the trainings that we get, through the ASWB board, examination that we take, and I think it takes a lot of work and thinking to think outside of this carceral box, right? It takes creativity, it takes time, it takes energy and resources. And what I think happens a lot of the time, especially in times of burnout, we revert back to this carceral box thinking, or even the practice itself. It says you have to make a call within 48 hours, or else you could go to jail and you can go face all these consequences. And the way that I think about that impacting us is like, right, it like causes this like panic, right? You could feel it in your heart, you could feel it in your chest. And when that happens, when this panic happens, we stop thinking outside of the box. We revert back to what we've been taught or what we've been trained, or maybe how we grew up. And we think about back to all these, actions that can fall within this box. And a huge piece of that is this liability piece. So we like, and I was in a social work group, Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting, shortly before the holiday break. And, we're talking about burnout at the end of the year, right? We know that child welfare cases go up at the end of the year, or reports go up at the end of the year. Everybody's stressed out, everybody's burnt out from the holidays, right? That's across the board. And I think, I wonder if a lot of these reports are coming in because of this burnout and because people aren't able to step outside of this box and think outside of this box, and just wanting to pass the baton on to somebody else so that they don't have the liability with them, over the break, or, having to follow up with people, right? So when I think about liability in particular, we'll make the call to ACS or CPS to pass the liability on, or we'll make the call to a preventive service to pass this liability on, right? Okay, this is somebody else's responsibility to follow up. And, what's really missing is our value of informal support structures. John Robertson, who's on this call, he directed me one time to this study, or this report that looked at a low-income community in Chicago, and typically the narrative about low-income communities is that there's no support, there's no resources, there's no sense of community, right? And that's not to say that these communities don't need money and they don't need financial resources, but this study also found that there were hundreds of informal forms of social supports and informal forms of social structures, right? People are helping each other. People are supporting each other, right? Maybe the man down the hall, he came to fix your radiator one time, right? Maybe the lady, in the next floor, she brought cookies to the front one time, right? All of these forms of informal supports are there. And as social workers, we are not taught to value them, because those informal supports don't have the liability that we're looking for, right? We can't say, okay, I'm gonna pass this family off to Miss Sally and my hands are clean, right? From anything that can come of it. We're so taught to pass it on to a formal type of structure in order to save our own professional selves, right? So that's one example. And Shalonda Curtis Hackett, who I think is also on this call, one time I was talking to her and she had this amazing idea. She was talking about how she's really involved in her school, or her old school's PTA, right? And what would it look like if a PTA like that was really funded and given the resources to provide support to other parents, right? This is already a group of parent leaders, already a group of parents who are well embedded in the community, who know the community, who can support other parents, who just don't have maybe the resources or the resources to commit the time, to do this, right? So what would it look like as professionals to be supporting this community building that already exists? Kamara, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah, I also just add on to that too, of like these informal structures don't have like the liability that we're looking for perception. And also the fact that we perceive that the folks who are running these informal structures don't also have the education, right? We're like invalidating a whole knowledge base because they might not have gone to social work school, or they don't have fancy letters or degrees. And so we're devaluing, right, the knowledge production that happens in communities, which we know, right, the academy is built off of the labor, the scholarship of everyday folks. And so thinking about even whose production or who thought process are centered in the whole liability and compliance. I also want to tag on to, because I think you already kind of touched on the burnout, making your report, Jasmine. So we touched on the savior complex, but I'll get into the individualizing and pathologizing the problem, thinking that the individual who is experiencing a life situation or a life event is the sole problem, which is, right, the lack of a root cause analysis. We're not saying, okay, well, what identities does this family have? What communities do they come from? What is the history of this group of people in this country? We're looking at a family, saying that they're unfit, right? And then taking children away, tearing families apart. We're also, I think it's important to think about with that, the fact that we're not really taught to take the time to really sit and listen with people, to hear the problems that people are experiencing and come up with solutions that actually make sense, right? Because if someone is showing up to class with dirty clothing, does it really make sense to call and have them removed for that space? Or, right, can we organize to say, oh, maybe they don't have a washer and dryer at home. What is a neighbor doing, right? Can a neighbor then wash the clothes? Can we then maybe give them a stipend for a local laundromat, right? Really thinking creatively about problems versus saying this person is the issue. Also with that, I think that one of the biggest things that we run into is really with parents also not being able to have a voice in what's happening, and people saying, well, I was told I was wrong, right? I often hear, I damned if I do, I damned if I don't. If I make a big deal, or if I have a big reaction about these folks coming into my home, then I'm seen as aggressive. I'm seen as the problem. I'm seen as, oh, well, right, we're perceiving abuse already, and this person gave us this, right, what they are perceiving as a loud reaction. But if you sit there and you act idly and you comply, right, that's still also being used against you, versus really bringing folks into the space and saying, okay, what is it that you need from us, right? And then actually doing that thing. Moving on, the next thing in the box is isolation, feeling like you're the only social worker. And then I'll get into the isolation of families in a second. But one of the most beneficial things that I think I'd say I'm a third generation social worker, although my great grandmother would have probably never identified as a social worker, but was definitely doing this work. One of the biggest things that really impacted me was leaning into community, was saying, oh, hey, I have, and being vocal. And of course, right, for some folks, depending on what your confidentiality looks like, you might not be able to go into full detail, but really bringing people together and saying, okay, I have a family who's struggling with X, Y, and Z. What are the community resources that exist in this area for us to be able to triage? Or saying, oh, hey, didn't you have a client who experienced this? Can you help me with something? So to combat that isolation, and with that, then you're building a deeper social work community. There's been so many times where I've reached out to people on this call to be able to say, like, hey, I need help with this thing. Can you help me think it through? To the isolation of the families, I think that one of the most impactful things, especially through our HEAL program that is run at JMAC for Families, that I've seen, is when we bring impacted parents together, they're like, oh my gosh, wait, let me tell you how to do this. There was this one parent, I won't, say her name in this space, but she was always really adamant about folks documenting things. So literally within our session, she would teach people like, yes, so you get this name of this person and you write this down and you take this, right? And you have your file. And so even in that space, folks began to build a deeper connection and community within folks who had been impacted. I think oftentimes, right, for some people, it's a badge of, and of course it would be a badge of, you're a bad parent, right? And everyone's kind of suffering in silence, which makes an organization like JMAC for Families so important and so necessary, saying that no, right, it's not us, it's the system, and here's how we're combating that. And so even when you get impacted folks together to then begin to push back, we're all fighting, right, that isolation.
And I mean, that's an example of a form of informal support, right? That is legal support, not advice, right? Because that gets tricky, but that's support in navigating ways to advocate for yourself in legal settings, right? From your peers, right? That's a legal, that's a form of informal support that is not valued by social workers, that's not valued by, society at large. But these quote unquote informal relationships are so crucial, and using our positionality to create those spaces. So Kamaria created the HEAL program, right? She used her positionality as a social worker and the resources that we were able to get from JMAC for Families and all of our funders to create that space for people who are impacted to be forming these relationships with each other, and supporting each other through their situations.
Which I think also too takes divesting from like your ego and what you think as a social worker needs to happen. It takes, I think sometimes we're doing these events, we're doing stuff, it's like, is that what even the people you serve need or what they want? Like, are you listening, right? So rather than maybe you doing the group, maybe you fund a group to come in that is a part of the community. Maybe your space is used as a place of organizing versus you being like, well, I want to do this thing, right? I think it takes divesting from that and centering the people who actually need to be centered. And then we also have here, oh, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to go on to the piece about being survivor centered. I think the majority of young people that I've known who have experienced harm in their lives or in their homes, many of them will tell you that they don't want to be separated from their families. They want the harm to stop. Right. And so what does it mean to be survivor centered if there is harm occurring? We know that the majority of cases are for reasons of poverty framed as neglect. Right. But in cases in which is harm occurring, what does it really mean to be survivor centered? What does it mean when a survivor says, I don't want to lose my family? Right. The majority of kids who, I've known who have experienced the system and aged out of the system still go back to their families when they age out, right? There's still that bond and that connection that's there, if systems haven't disrupted that in the process, right? So this idea that, we have to make a report, no matter what, right? How is that, reinforcing carceral systems, and how are we replicating the police in some ways, right? Many of us understand that police tend not to be survivor-centered, especially when it comes to domestic violence or sexual assault, right? And so what do we do as social workers to combat that narrative or combat that, norm? So as Kamari was saying, within the carceral box, there's all these interlocking systems of surveillance, prisons, foster care, family regulation, preventive services. There's this huge movement, based on the federal legislation that passed in 2018 to shift towards preventive services. And this one, I can go on about because it gets into the next piece about deficiency-oriented language, right? Preventive services. What does that language itself tell you? Or what is that language itself communicating? It's communicating that unless we prevent something, abuse is going to happen, neglect is going to happen. We, as this federally funded or state-funded program, have to come in and prevent this abuse from happening, right? I think about words like at-risk youth, at-risk communities. This is, deficiency-oriented language, and it really, encourages this flood of social service programs that, don't promote really child well-being in the same way that we see child well-being in middle-class families. And, an example that I'll give is, think about the word coach, right? Coach or class. In middle-class families, upper-class families, children have soccer coaches, football coaches, public speaking coaches, art classes. These are all things that nurture creativity. They nurture peer support. They nurture, working together to achieve a goal. They nurture this sense of community, right? Now think about the types of coaches that are in low-income communities. You have behavioral coaches, you have therapeutic behavioral coaches, and I was one for a while. You have parenting classes, parent coaches, right? These are all coaches and classes that are aimed at rectifying a behavior, a problematic, quote unquote, behavior, right? You don't see the same resource flood of services to promote child well-being or to nurture creativity. When I was a therapeutic behavioral coach, we were coloring, right? Me and a 4-year-old coloring. How is that really nurturing your support? How is that nurturing child well-being, right? And I see half of these chats, things in the chat, but one example too that I'll give is these preventive services that fit within this carceral box, in which all of the employees are mandated reporters, are a band-aid, right? Or are a workaround to the real problem. I worked as a MSW intern at a nonprofit, and the model was, attachment biobehavioral catch-up. The idea of this is we are teaching parents how to, be responsive parents, or how to do responsive parenting, in order to counteract toxic stress caused by racism and poverty. And that's on the website, right? So the idea is that if parents are gentle, or parents are, doing this certain type of parenting model, that can stop the impacts of poverty and racism, right? This is a multi-million-dollar nonprofit aimed at rectifying a behavior rather than addressing the issue. The issue is racism and poverty, right? But we're spending all this money to, surveil, to rectify behavior, quote unquote problematic behavior, and to, really take the focus away from what the true issue is, which is racism and poverty.
Yeah, and when you don't name the risk, right? The risk is white supremacy and all of the other interlocking systems of oppression, not individual families, which I think just further feeds into that pathologizing when you don't name what the actual cause is. So I think we've gotten a lot of what's inside of the carceral box. And due to time, I'm going to shift this, Jasmine, to the external, if you're okay with that. So outside of a carceral box and a carceral gaze, I think for me, a part of this is moving from our survival mindset, right? Getting folks to just merely survive, but how do we encourage living a life where people can thrive, where people can live in safe communities, where those informal, quote unquote, support systems are really centered as some of the crux of what makes life enjoyable. I grew up with a mom who was raised in the 70s, and so I always heard, each one, reach one, teach one. It takes a village to raise a child, right? Like all these very deep ethos about kinship ties and community and how people engage with one another, living in spaces where people, you have multiple people who are looking out for you and watching out for you. I mean, now that, right, informs my lens of community and my lens of what support looks like. And so how do we center those metrics? That comes from resource mapping. I think if you are a social worker who does not know what other supports look like in your community, there's something really wrong with that, right? In ones that are divested from harm and not carceral, not other avenues that people can be funneled into the system. But how can we then begin to give more money, more support, and maybe, right, we know it's an underfunded field, so maybe you don't necessarily have money, but more support to actually make some of these informal structures, and we're using quotes with informal, more formal, more centralized, so that other folks in the community can have access to them, so that we then, right, the point of social work is supposed to be, in my eyes, to work ourselves out of a job, to work ourselves out of these issues, right? If we're not naming them, though, we're just going to continue to slap a Band-Aid on it. And I think those are ways that we get away from centering those systems of harm when we are able to have more central metrics of what people actually need. So like I said, providing funding, if you can, I'd say leveraging your role, right? I think people often get really tied up with, well, here's the scope of my role, right? We're always like, here, what's in the scope of my role, right? What does my job description say? And yes, in a lot of ways for establishing your own personal boundaries, that's deeply important. But as a social work intern, I was at an organization where I was supposed to be teaching parenting classes, right? Supposed to be teaching parenting classes for folks who were, they were clinically described as having intellectual disabilities. Couple things with that. When folks came in the door, I realized a lot of those diagnoses were based off of really gross misunderstandings of folks' culture. And we know that Black women are most likely to be diagnosed as having bipolar disorder, when oftentimes that's not true. Sometimes it is, of course. And so that was one thing that really came up. Another thing was the fact that they're having me teaching parents, oftentimes folks who had many children already, who were vets in the game as far as having children goes, child development classes, when in reality, they were like, hey, I need X, Y, and Z support. And so a part of leveraging my role there, thinking right from a decarceral lens, I was like, okay, so we're gonna do this little parenting class. I'm gonna go through the slides. I'm gonna show you the parenting stuff, right? And then afterwards, we spent 30 minutes on that. Then for the rest of our time, I'm like, okay, what do you need? What's the services? Okay, boom, I have this number. I have that person who can help you. Call this person, go to this office, right? I'm calling around for them. We're talking about things. Some of that was a little sometimes informal therapy, right? But that's a way I leveraged my role, because I was like, this is not the need. I'm listening, right? That deep active listening where my ego is discentered and who I am is out of the picture, and I'm really just holding space for the family. I was able to say, well, that's not what they need, right? So are there ways that you can be doing that in your scope and your role? And I know that feels very scary. I know it feels kind of maybe wrong in some ways for some people, but thinking about the burnout, to be honest, so many people were burned out at that organization that no one even knew. No one even noticed, right? But in the end, I was able to actually support people in the ways that they needed. So I think about, like, what are you willing to risk, right? What does that look like for you? What is your commitment to the families and the communities that you serve? I think when you're not trying to be a savior, right, you're really willing to make more risky things to make justice and equity actually happen for people. Jasmine already touched on being survivor-centered, right, which means honoring all the choices of survivors, which means giving them informed consent, letting them know what all the options mean. That could be like, hey, someone wants to maybe call the police in a particular situation. Okay, let me tell you what goes into that. Let me let you know all of the ins and outs. Let me let you know possible outcomes of what that could be like, right? And then no matter what the decision is, right, still being able to show up and support that individual person. Harm reduction, we talk a lot about this in social work, but then our practices, right, don't align with that. How can we move harm reduction from just fluid theories, right, that we give quotes to and we shout out, versus how we're actually doing that in the field, which comes from those risks, which comes from thinking about, right, what people need and actually doing that, which means that sometimes you're not the person, right? When you're not thinking of yourself as a savior, it's just who can get this need fulfilled for this family, right? Which means it might not be you. And something that I feel like I wish social workers were taught was imagination and creativity. Something that I'll tell people is that, what do you love to do? Like, what are you passionate about as a, and this last part is mostly like, right, for like social workers and people who are mandated reporters. What do you love to do? How can you bring that into the space of your role as a social worker? I think the role is oftentimes such a heavy, dark one, but I'm like, where's the love, right? Where's the joy? Are you leading with that? What is that? I mean, I feel like Black feminist nonfiction, Octavia Butler, has taught me so much about how to interact with community, about how to reimagine what our world could look like. So are there more innovative and imaginative ways that you can be approaching the work that you do? I think creativity is really underestimated in what things could look like, right? If we leaned into some of those. I think creativity is an informal metric, but thinking about innovative solutions to the things that our communities and families are facing.
And I'll add, build that toolbox now, right? If you're feeling, I don't know, inspired or like energetic after this webinar or webinars like this, build your toolbox now, because like I said, when burnout occurs, that panic sets in, right? That inability to think creatively, oh my gosh, and revert back to this carceral mindset sets in, right? So building that toolbox, thinking creatively, working with colleagues, coming to meetings of like-minded people, right? These are all steps in building your toolbox. And as we move towards the end, one thing I'll just highlight that Kumaria said earlier is that mandated reporting is not evidence-based, right? We are a profession that preaches evidence-based practices. We talk about it all the time. That's all that gets funded, right? Mandated reporting is not evidence-based. What is evidence-based is, if you want to go to the next slide, increasing anti-poverty programs, giving people more money and leaving them alone, right? earned income tax credit, child tax credit, reduce reports of child maltreatment, right? And I want to be clear that just because there's a report doesn't mean that child maltreatment has occurred, right? We know that the majority of reports are for reasons related to poverty, right? So earned income tax credit, child tax credit, reduced reports, child care subsidy, reduced reports, Medicaid expansion, increasing the minimum wage by $1 reduces reports of child maltreatment by 10%, right? Increased provision of material services. So giving people stuff that they need food, they need clothing, utilities, housing, transportation, all lead to reduction in reports. And 30% of foster children could be home right now if their families had quote unquote decent housing. So I'm seeing a lot of questions about, will we get, these slides? We will send these out in the next coming days. We have all of your emails from your signups. So we'll send out these slides and we'll send out a couple of opportunities that we have for you all for action steps. But just to name a few, if you could go to the next slide. It's pretty exciting. We have set up, so first sign up for the jmac for Families newsletter, and you can do that at the jmac for Families website. If you're interested in bringing the mandated supporting curriculum to your school, you can email me or your workplace, and so we can coordinate that. In New York State, we have an upcoming hearing on the harms of mandated reporting. That the Assembly Committee on Children and Families is hosting on February 16th in Manhattan, right? So please sign up if you're in New York, or if you're not in New York, you can submit a written submission. If you're in New York City, we would love to have you there. We'll be hosting a rally beforehand, but that link in this slide is where you can just find out some more information and even just get, on our listserv. In the next few weeks, we'll send out information to your emails about focus groups about mandated reporting. So in New York State, we're working towards legislation to amend the mandated reporting laws, to reduce some of the harms. And all of the things that Kamari and we talked about today in terms of supporting rather than reporting, these we might not have to talk about it in this way if the law wasn't so harsh, right? Or if the law didn't require, have all these liability statutes, right? So we're looking to amend the law and change the ways that our profession practices. So please keep an eye out for focus group meetings. You don't have to be in New York State to participate. This next one is also national. The Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting group that I briefly spoke about is a coalition of mandated reporters who, are against mandated reporting. So they host 2 meetings per month. One is focused on case processing. So what do you do, when there's sexual abuse? Or what do you do when you don't know how to talk to your supervisor, right? What do you do when there's XYZ, right? So really about case processing and getting kind of the hands-on peer supervision that a lot of mandated reporters don't receive in their, traditional organizations. And then the other piece of that is an organizing space, for national, work towards ending mandated reporting. So you can follow their Instagram and Twitter, or email that email to get on the listserv. And then Kamaria.
Sorry, I'm trying to get the mute button with the share screen, and I'm not getting off mute. And then I have my own private practice, kitchen counter social work. If you're interested in even in the private practice space, how you go about utilizing mandated supporting as a lens in your paperwork with your clients. We talked a lot about it in the context of family regulation, but also how does this show up? I mean, the conversation of clients with suicidality is really rampant right now, in the ways that mandated reporting has also been deeply harmful there. So feel free to reach out. There's my email and Instagram. And I think we are at about.
We did pretty good on time.
I'm shocked. I'm proud of us.
Sorry, we don't have time for questions, but we will be doing another presentation, I believe in March or so, with CE credits. So, please stay tuned to the NASW New York page.
Absolutely. I just want to thank you both. I'm going to stop this recording.